Right after World War II, Libya was taken over by France and the United Kingdom, which administratively connected it to their colonies in Algeria and Tunisia. The UK supported the establishment of a monarchy led by the Senussi dynasty, which was aligned with Saudi Arabia and recognized by the UN. This dynasty governed Libya since its nominal independence in 1951 under King Idris I. His reign was characterized by a lack of enlightenment, prioritizing British economic and military interests over the welfare of the Libyan people. Despite the discovery of oil reserves in 1959, the wealth generated did not benefit the populace. One political analyst noted that during the monarchy, Libya suffered from significant deficiencies in education, healthcare, housing, and social security. The literacy rate was alarmingly low, with only 250,000 out of the 4 million residents were able to read and write, reflecting a broader societal backwardness during this period. In 1969, the Senussi dynasty was ousted by a faction of military officers led by Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, who declared genuine independence and expelled the prevailing foreign powers from Libya. One of Gaddafi's first actions was to ensure that the nation's wealth and resources were distributed among all Libyans. Since Gaddafi came to power, oil became the primary asset controlled by the leader of the newly established Libyan Arab Republic. The success of the 1969 revolution signaled a major shift as the government began using oil revenue to fund programs aimed at redistributing wealth and fostering a new path of economic and social progress for the nation. Experts point out that among the key policies of economic sovereignty were the nationalization of several Western oil companies, including British Petroleum, and the formation of the National Oil Corporation, reflecting a shift towards a more socialist approach. During Gaddafi's rule, a range of ambitious social programs were introduced, focusing on education, healthcare, housing, infrastructure, and subsidies for electricity and essential food items. These efforts significantly improved the quality of life for Libyans, transforming the country from one of Africa's poorest in 1969 to the continent's leader in its Human Development Index by 2011. According to the United Nations Development Programme 2010, Libya was recognized as a highly developed nation in the Middle East and North Africa. This status reflected achievements such as a literacy rate of 88.4%, a life expectancy of 74.5 years, and progress in gender equality, among other positive indicators. Domestically, Gaddafi managed to address two major challenges within Libyan society: controlling the tribal structure and uniting a fragmented society made up of diverse and sometimes conflicting tribal and regional groups. Gaddafi successfully maintained unity among Libya's roughly 140 tribes, each with its own distinct traditions and origins, despite the limited connections between them. On the international front, Gaddafi's commitment to Pan-Arabism stood out, particularly in his opposition to U.S. influence in the Middle East and Africa. He forged stronger alliances with Arab nations to collectively reject Washington's policies in these regions. Gaddafi also worked to build closer relationships with neighboring countries such as Egypt, Morocco, Syria, Tunisia, and Chad, while maintaining ties with global powers like France and Russia. Furthermore, he established connections with Latin American nations like Venezuela and Cuba, creating an expansive network that challenged both European and US interests. By the time of his death, Libya boasted the highest GDP per capita and life expectancy in Africa, and the percentage of people living below the poverty line was lower than that of the Netherlands. 13 years have passed since the United Nations authorized military action in Libya under the justification of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. At that time, it was argued that Libya's civilians needed safeguarding from the harshness of President Muammar Gaddafi's regime amid an uprising against his government. 8 months later, Gaddafi's regime fell. The civil war that raged from February to October 2011 tore the country apart, turning Libya from Africa's safest and wealthiest nation into a fractured and dangerous state. Gaddafi was killed on October 20, 2011, marking a turning point that forever changed the country. Those who backed the UN so-called humanitarian intervention at that time believe the world should be celebrating that finally nations have united to conduct military action solely for humanitarian purposes. Libyans especially were expected to rejoice with gratitude that the UN has stepped in to save them in such an extraordinary way. However, the so-called victory in Libya 13 years ago was nothing more than another Western-driven war aimed at destabilizing what was once a stable nation. The intervention sought to forcefully overthrow the Libyan government, violating international law and the UN Charter, which clearly forbade any interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign countries. In March 2011, the UN approved using force against Libya, but this decision was based on false information and unreliable media reports. Even now, no real reason has been given for the war. It's clear that Western countries, especially France, the UK, and the US, started the war to benefit themselves. Some of the false claims against Gaddafi's government at the time included allegations of genocide, an imminent massacre in Benghazi, airstrikes on civilians, and widespread sexual violence. However, none of these events actually occurred. The first reports of genocide in Libya surfaced on February 21, 2011, just 3 days after the uprising began, when Ibrahim Dabashi, a Libyan diplomat to the UN who had joined the rebel forces, warned that we are expecting genocide in Tripoli, the Libyan capital. Genocide typically involves the mass killing of civilians, often in the hundreds or thousands, based on their ethnic or religious identity. But the conflict in Libya was neither religious nor ethnic. At that stage, it wasn't even a tribal war. Despite this, global media amplified the narrative, and the belief that genocide was happening in Libya spread widely. Both Al Jazeera TV and the BBC World Service reported for the first time that the Libyan Air Force had bombed peaceful civilian demonstrations. Al Jazeera Arabic specifically named Faslum, a densely populated neighborhood near Tripoli, as one of the targets. A witness who was nearby on that day immediately went to the area to investigate. Upon arrival, there was no sign of a demonstration, let alone evidence of military jet bombing the area. No one could confirm the report, and by midday, it became evident that the story was false. Despite this, the misleading information had already influenced public opinion. The accusation of mass rape was even harder to prove and was never confirmed. Major news outlets reported that government soldiers were given Viagra to encourage them to commit mass rapes. The story gained a lot of attention when Imam al-Obeidi, a young woman from Benghazi, walked into the International Media Center in Tripoli, where all the foreign journalists covering the war were gathered. She told the cameras that she had been repeatedly raped by government soldiers at a checkpoint near Tripoli. While government officials tried to take her away, major news channels like CNN and BBC were already broadcasting her story live around the world. Her story was never verified. Another false accusation was that the government used mercenaries to fight the rebels, which claims that most of the fighters were from sub-Saharan Africa. The rebels, with the support of major TV networks, said that thousands of mercenaries were flown in from sub-Saharan Africa. Many poor sub-Saharan Africans were arrested and paraded in the streets by the rebels as foreign soldiers hired by Gaddafi, but in reality, they were workers, not fighters. Amnesty International, a global human rights group, later disproved the claim, confirming that these people were workers from Mali and Chad who had never been involved in the fighting. The only black soldier captured by the rebels was in the city of Bieda in eastern Libya. He was a young Libyan soldier from a group guarding military barracks. Tragically, he was tortured and killed in a horrific way, which was filmed on mobile phones. His name was Salah Shushan, and his family in western Libya appeared on local TV to confirm his identity. Many Libyans still remember him with sadness as he pleaded with his captors to believe that he was Libyan, just like them, and not a mercenary. The war in Libya was pushed by false claims. One big lie was about the supposed massacre in Benghazi. People said the government soldiers would kill many civilians if they took over the city, but these soldiers were actually only fighting against armed rebels, not civilians. Before even getting close to Benghazi, these soldiers went through several towns that the rebels had left. No civilians were hurt there. Instead, when the soldiers came, people who had run away from the rebels came back because the soldiers protected them. The biggest lie was about the responsibility to protect idea. This was used as a reason to attack Libya, saying it was to save civilians. But there was no real threat to civilians from the government. The real threats were from armed groups like al-Qaeda, not the government. So this idea of protecting people was misused by other countries for their own benefits, not for the Libyans. By October 20th, 2011, the fighting in Libya was almost over. Gaddafi was killed, but the lies used to justify ruining Libya still show how everyone was tricked. Some thought the UN stepping in was a good thing, like the world coming together to help people in trouble. They thought Libyans would be thankful for this big rescue. But really, what happened in Libya was just another war pushed by Western countries. They took Libya from being Africa's most prosperous and safest nation and left it poor and unsafe.